This is the next part of emotional behaviors, where I will talk about the different brain regions that are involved. And at the very end of this slide presentation is a short review addressing the questions that I did receive. So to begin talking about the brain areas that are associated with emotion, I'm going to start by just giving this picture of the limbic system. So all of these four brain areas surrounding the thalamus. The limbic system, if you remember me saying early on, it's kind of this border system, as it's called, between the subcortical structures and the cortical structures, and it includes a lot of these areas that are active when we are having our emotions. So emotionally associated memory areas, but also remember emotionally associated memory areas. So the amygdala and the hippocampus are in there. If you look in this picture, you can see that the amygdala, where we know, right, that we have a lot of emotional processing. We process the expression on other people's faces. I'm going to talk about the amygdala more after the exam, but it is involved, right, with fear and anger, and then that kind of classical conditioning. So the pain, when we have pain, we want to avoid making a certain response to get that pain. We're gonna lay that information down in a conditioning kind of way with the amygdala. But you can see it is very much connected with the hippocampus, where we have our more explicit memory consolidation going on. So the limbic system includes the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the mammillary bodies, the thalamus. The hypothalamus we know is also involved with emotion, right, as it's giving us that autonomic response, sympathetic nervous system response. And the other areas that I want to include for talking about emotion specifically are the cingulate gyrus and the insula. And you can see by this picture, there are a few more structures that are included here, as I mentioned before, and why I did not ask you to memorize the brain regions that are included in the limbic system is if you go and look this up, people disagree about which brain systems should be, or brain regions should be included in the limbic system. But also included are, as part of our emotional processing, are the cingulate gyrus and the insula are the other ones I'm going to talk about. And then, as is also included in with emotion in a really different manner, is the prefrontal cortex. And of course, that's up in the cerebral cortex very clearly in the frontal lobes. And when it's not included as part of the limbic system, but to a large extent, it is helping us to inhibit a lot of the times these emotional structures, as we're going to have this kind of subcortical response, and the prefrontal cortex is going to allow us to have a more thought through response. So oftentimes this means inhibiting some of this emotional response. This is one of my favorite pictures when talking about emotion because it expresses so much in a picture. And I do this sometimes with attention when I talk about attention of this kind of, this is your brain on attention, and it includes all of these different areas of the brain. And there is a lot that is included in that couched term of attention, right? This kind of really lower level attention, this higher level attention, the am I inhibiting an unwanted response? Am I selectively attending? All of that. Well, emotion is even more kind of complicated with how much is included and how much is involved with our emotional processing. So he gives us these brain images that are showing, so all of the yellow dots, for example, are showing results from different studies of where they found brain activity when they were inducing happiness in somebody. And the blue is sadness, green is disgust, and so on. And you can see again for all of these different emotions, they are really all over the brain. And in fact, it has more to do with the task or procedure of what the participant is doing than it has to do with the specific emotion that they are feeling or that is being induced. That was just a very basic description of the limbic system and really the brain regions involved in emotion. And we have not yet talked about the prefrontal cortex and its role which is a really different role than just these kind of emotional responses that we're having to stimuli or to our environment. And we also, so we still need to talk about the prefrontal cortex. We still need to talk more seriously and more completely about the amygdala. The amygdala is a very important structure, and we'll talk about that in fear and aggressive responses. Okay, I'm going to answer some questions I received, and if this works really well for people and you like it, you can email me and let me know that you like this. But these are not questions that are specific to the review. I just looked through the review and tried to come up with questions of clarification and things that I usually get asked, and nothing popped out at me as something that gets asked every single semester. And so I'm just going to walk through some of the questions that I received that were more questions about the PowerPoint slides in those presentations since the break. So the ones that went online, the ones about both wake-sleep cycles and about emotion. So I received a question about the Schachter-Singer theory of emotion, and I'm going to bumble through this. This is a complicated question, and it's a complicated kind of answer, and I'm going to do this as briefly as I can, really. So the question, Allie asked if the cognitive appraisal was necessarily conscious, or could that be an unconscious kind of appraisal? And so what brain regions are involved with that cognitive appraisal, really? And what's happening in those times of high stress or pressure where it doesn't really seem like you're necessarily thinking through, or I would say you're not necessarily consciously, cognitively appraising your situation. And I added in there, or panic, because I gave that example of the garden hose. So if I see something that maybe out of the corner of my eye looks like a snake, I might see that as a snake. And if I have a phobia, I'm going to panic and run, right? So that cognitive appraisal for the purposes of Schachter and Singer, that was occurring. I'm going to interpret that as being very unconsciously, because it is happening before we're experiencing the emotional response. And sometimes that emotional response really does seem like a very quick action of response, where we don't feel like we have much. There's not much that seems to happen between the environmental stimulus and the emotion. So I'm going to put that in kind of the unconscious area. She also asked about brain regions, and so because I think we think of cognitive appraisal as happening more at probably the prefrontal cortex, and somewhere where we have the chance to really think things through. So I'm going to keep going back to that snake example. If I see it as a snake and I panic and run, I am reacting off of the activity of those subcortical structures, right? I panicked based on the amygdala and my limbic system telling me that I'm afraid, run. But if I look back and I say, and I can stand there for a second and have the sense to look back and say, oh wait, that's just a garden hose, or even I see snakes in my yard all the time, and I usually take a second look to see whether or not I can go find out whether or not they're going to be poisonous, because I want to keep my dogs inside for a while. If I see a poisonous snake, I don't care. If I see a non-poisonous snake, if my dogs go outside, everything seems okay, right? So, I mean, if we're doing that, that is a more conscious cognitive appraisal, but it's different than what Schachter and Singer are talking about with the cognitive appraisal. That is a more conscious kind of, yes, I'm thinking that through with my prefrontal cortex. I'm thinking through and making some informed decision instead of just having this emotional reaction. There was one more piece to that, because they really did not. When they proposed this theory of emotion, these theories of emotion, the psychology with neuroscience, and then the psychology to anatomy and biology, some of that was not really clear. And as you see, as we've just talked about emotion in these different regions of the brain where we see activity due to different specific emotions, it's really not clear what specific brain activity is occurring with particular emotions. And so I would say Schachter-Singer, that cognitive appraisal is definitely unconscious, as again I'm having this emotional response, and that response is That's happening very quickly without oftentimes without any conscious processing. And if we have that later kind of, oh, this is what's happening, that prefrontal cortex decision making, as we're going to talk about after the exam, that that's really a different level. And as I mentioned this time, there's this inhibition from the prefrontal cortex to some of those limbic structures. If we have strong inhibition and inhibitory connections, we can handle a lot of that much more graciously. Okay, so I did babble around that, and not sure I'm completely answering that, and I think I did a better job I did email her back. Okay, I got a couple of questions about narcolepsy and hypnagogic hallucinations. I think I can address this a little bit more straightforwardly. So Madeline asked, is somebody still awake? So are their eyes open during a hypnagogic hallucination? And so no, this is a transition. This is really a transition from waking to sleep, or what they call a hypnopompic hallucination is a transition from sleeping to being awake. And there are aspects of REM sleep that are still influencing you while you're in this, even really before stage, or really in stage 1 sleep, because stage 1 sleep in itself is almost, I don't want to call that a transition, but really at the beginning of stage 1 sleep. Okay. She also asked, do narcoleptics experience these hypnagogic hallucinations more intensely? And I said, not as far as I know, no, they do not experience them more intensely. But we would not necessarily be able to tell, because we're all just describing our experiences, and how intense that is to a particular person is going to depend on a lot of things, right? Specific to that person. And even when we're describing how intensely we experience, or how vividly we experience something, it's hard to tell where people's criteria are. So how would we know? I don't know. They do experience them more frequently. So if you've had them, they are disturbing, and you can have some real compassion for people who have narcolepsy, that they are experiencing these often. I've had a few hypnagogic hallucinations myself over the years. A couple are very few visual and more auditory, and they are usually very disturbing to me. And the auditory ones have become much less disturbing since I understand what hypnagogic hallucinations are. But the visual ones are still, they're really creepy sometimes. So somebody else was asking about, it was Caroline who asked about, are hypnagogic hallucinations the same as sleep paralysis? And she was also describing a pretty disturbing hypnagogic hallucination. They really can be unnerving to an extent. But again, if you can at least tell yourself, hey, that was a hypnagogic hallucination, that might help you to just calm down a little bit and take a second, breathe, and go back to sleep without kind of that really creeped out, fearful feeling, because you know that, hey, this is what this is. This is just all that's really happening. But no, so hypnagogic hallucinations are not the same as sleep paralysis. In both cases, there are aspects of REM sleep that are influencing us, but sleep paralysis, people really do wake up. They open their eyes and they're awake, and they're unable to move because the pons is still inhibiting those postural muscles, those large muscles. And so it can be, if you don't know what's happening, that can be really scary. And I have had 1 or 2 students where I've told them this is what's happening, and I hope that it's calmed them down, because if you're stuck in bed and you can't move, that feels frightening. But it really is just aspects of REM sleep are influencing you while you are awake. Different aspects of REM sleep are influencing you those aspects of REM sleep are influencing you during hypnagogic hallucinations, but again, it's during that transition from waking to sleep. And so you can have those hallucinations. No hallucinations are associated with sleep paralysis, but hypnagogic hallucinations, hypnopompic hallucinations, those are aspects of REM sleep that are not occurring during REM sleep. They're happening during those transitions. And why they are usually pretty creepy, I don't know why they're not the more, oh, I was doing my dishes or something that, we normally do sometimes during our dreams. Although those kinds of really common, I was doing my dishes, I was doing my laundry, I was walking to class, those are usually occurring during non-REM sleep. Those ones that don't really have a storyline, but are probably just processing our waking life a little bit. I had one more thing I was going to talk about. I'm not thinking about it. Okay, I'll end there, and do let me know if you have questions. Remember that the exam is on Wednesday, so ask questions. All right. Hope you all are doing well. Happy Monday.